on YouTube. So if you agree, we just can start. I'll just.
Let's just wait for Thomas. He's
yes, sure.
He's not there. He's been waiting. He was the first one on. He's been waiting a couple minutes, so he's probably gone to get some water. Which is what
Thomas
I'll do.
is here.
I'm here. I'm here. Can you not see me?
Yes, we can see you.
Yeah, I see you. Good. Fantastic. Good.
Fantastic.
So the world is as it should be.
Fantastic.
All right.
Great. So Elena, you tell us. You put all the connections on. You tell us when you're sending us out to the World Wide Web and YouTube.
Yeah, we're already on. Yeah, we're already online.
We're already on.
Yes.
Okay, fantastic.
And I can see that already 33 attendees are online, so we're live. And I would like to start with thanking everyone for joining our Interparliamentary live stream, Parliament's Responses to the Pandemic and the Importance of Parliamentary Oversight, which is organized on the occasion of International Day of Parliamentarism, and which is annually celebrated on 30th of June. And as you already know, InterPares, Parliaments in Partnership is a EU global project to strengthen the capacity of parliaments, and it's the first global parliamentary project of its kind. It's funded by the European Union and implemented by International IDEA, and its purpose is to strengthen the capacity of parliaments in partner countries by enhancing their legislative, oversight, representative, budgetary, and administrative functions. So due to the COVID-19 crisis, many organizations and projects, including InterPares, had to adapt to the new circumstances and refocus main activities. That is why the main focus of our event today is to showcase the work and recent initiatives of the European Union, International IDEA, and of course the InterPares project during COVID-19 crisis. We're also going to preview our project on mapping of Parliament's responses to the pandemic today. And our special guest, Dr. Olivier Rosenberg, Associate Professor at Sciences PARES, will talk about parliamentary oversight during the pandemic with the mentioning of virtual parliaments. So we have a very busy agenda today, and before we start with the first presentation, I just would like to point out that you already, all the attendees should have received the guide for to use WebEx events. So you're all muted by default, but you can use the chat box if you have any technical questions or issues. And I also will encourage you to activate attendees button so you can see other attendees. And during the Q&A session, you will be able to ask your questions in the Q&A chat or using your audio. I also would like to remind you that this event is broadcasted to our YouTube channel and it will be recorded. And of course, as a follow-up of the event, we will publish a short summary on our website shortly. And last but not least, if you post in anything about the event on social media, please tag InterPares and of course use the hashtag World Parliament Day. So I would like to introduce you to our first speaker, Thomas Miller, the head of section of democracy governance of DG DevCo at the European Commission, who will talk about democracy initiatives and the EU response to COVID-19. So Thomas, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Elena. Well, thank you all for joining, whoever you are, parliamentarians, CSOs, journalists, individuals, and so on. I suspect you're all working under some kind of confinement. As you can see, I'm working from home, so I hope I don't get any unexpected visitors. Today, we celebrate International Day of Parliamentarism, which marks the day when the Interparliamentary Union was established in 1889, 130 years ago. I think it's obviously an excellent occasion to conduct this event, which is basically to discuss how parliaments have responded to the COVID crisis, the challenges that they face and how they've adapted and innovated. And just to begin, I want to thank you all for participating. I thank the project team into PARES, International IDEA, our partners here, Professor Rosenberg from Sciences Po Paris, and my team working in the Commission in DevCo. I only have 5 minutes, so I better be quick. But first of all, on the crisis itself, or whether you call it a crisis, a challenge, an emergency, as some call it, the COVID crisis is clearly a governance and democracy crisis, as much as it is a health crisis, as a socio-economic crisis. The regressions that we've seen in democracy have been going on for many years, the autocratization, if you like, the restraints on the separations of powers, the ascendance of the executive, the crackdown on civic and political space and on media, just to name a few. Now, it's important to remember that, and it's important to also bear in mind that it's COVID, which is not creating these issues, but it's deepening and accelerating them in various different ways. The misuse of emergency powers, excessive use of these powers, the centralization of authority, limits on checks and balances, including, of course, legislative parliaments, corruption and the loss of oversight that we're seeing, the restriction of info, the spread of disinfo, increased surveillance, and of course, electoral disruption. Now, the EU's response has been manifold. Firstly, as you might expect, and you can see from my policy statements and from my commission and so on, has been to respond to the health crisis and the related humanitarian needs. Following up on that, of course, the socio-economic impact. But at the same time, as it's been frequently underlined, there is going to be no retreat from our normal governance standards and the basic values at which we hold dear and inform everything we do. And this is followed through in a number of different ways. Firstly, I think we've very quickly issued guidance to our delegations on how to reorientate their funds to some of the issues that I've just mentioned, particularly through the thematic fund that we have, the European Instrument for Democracy and Human Rights. Second of all, I think that the money that is being accelerated and often channeled through government to meet these needs, meet the humanitarian and other needs, making sure we have the correct safeguards and oversight over the use of these funds. And thirdly, making sure that the pre-programming, the stage we're in within the European Commission on looking at the funding for the coming years, that is it's underlined that democracy itself is not only essential to responding to the crisis, but making societies more resilient in the future. And with our programming, governance is one of the key pillars for us, and within that, issues of democracy, inclusion, and transparency. Now, to do all this kind of work, to respond and adapt as we want to be able to, this requires information and another launch coming up. We have the global monitor launch next week, again with IDEA. This is to look at the impact of COVID on human rights and democracy worldwide, providing public access to data and analysis on the measures and actions taken on 162 countries, and that will be updated twice monthly. It's a tracker of trackers, if you will. Coming into PARES itself, well, now obviously we and you alike believe parliaments are crucial for democracy. And PARES is our flagship project, unique for two main reasons, really. Firstly, it's the first ever global project of its kind. And second of all, it's peer-to-peer, supporting our partner parliaments around the world through exchanges with EU member state parliaments. It was launched July 2019, about a year ago, a limited budget, €5 million, which may not sound too limited, but nevertheless a pilot project for 3 years, implemented by International IDEA, as you know. The aim of the project is to strengthen Parliament's core functions: representation, legislation, oversight, budget administration. But we concentrate on 6 thematic areas, including gender equality, human rights, youth, civil society, climate change, and digitalization. And we work at 2 levels, with MPs and the staff of the Secretariat of these parliaments. Now, look, there are challenges we faced. It's a pilot project, it has limited budget, it's trying to have a global scope. And I'm glad to say, although this presents challenges, we've had more interest than we can manage. We canvassed delegations on their interest. We've had sort of 40 different responses. And we aimed initially to work with 15 to 25 countries every 3 years, rolling out a new partnership with 5 different countries every 6 months. And the first round began in September of last year. Second round should have been happening round about now. Now, what has COVID done? Well, it's made things as everywhere and in everything much more difficult. Shock, first of all. Many activities have had to be cancelled, postponed. Then, of course, there's the issue of how parliaments can continue to respond, to adjust and carry out their functions. And there it was very clear to us that interparliamentary cooperation was needed more than ever. We saw an opportunity to contribute, and that's why the initiatives you're seeing today, the primer being produced, the mapping which is going live today, have been set in motion. In addition, we've tried to adapt the activities that we're doing, obviously like this event, making the country-specific activities virtual, and developing new kinds of e-learning modules. To conclude, I don't know if I'm keeping some time, we can, there's a new normal here. So we're going to try and resume activities as best we can and adapt and innovate where we need to. And we're going to try and drive forward the sort of digitalized approach to the kind of work we're going to be doing. Reduced ambition, at least in terms of the scope of what we can do, but not reduced in the kind of thinking and innovation that we want to be able to do with programs like this. So looking at maybe 15 countries and no third round of countries in 2020. I think I'll leave it there for now for those introductory remarks, and I'll come in later on and obviously in the conclusion as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Thomas. And I think you set the scene very well for the discussion today. And thank you for mentioning both inter-PARES and international idea. And now I will give the microphone to Laura Thornton, Director for Global Program of International IDEA, and she will talk a bit more on initiatives of International IDEA in the recent crisis.
Hello. Thumbs up?
Yeah, we hear you.
Okay, great. My children would say I'm having a boomer moment, even though I'm not quite a boomer. Thank you very much. No, thank you so much for letting me participate in this important event. And I think, you know, Tom sort of stole a lot of my thunder and some of the remarks I was going to say, and he added it up more eloquently than I would. But I do think that what we all agree on here is that this is indeed a governance crisis, as Tom said. And understandably, you know, the world is preoccupied with the economic and health fallouts. However, we believe that, you know, the democratic governance component is extremely important to keep track of, particularly since we were seeing already sort of weakening and backsliding across the globe in these areas. And the pandemic in some ways has sort of brought pre-existing conditions to light. I think Tom outlined some of the various impacts that we've seen with regard to, you know, abuse of emergency power and manipulation of decisions to hold or postpone elections. I have to say, one thing I do hear a little bit less discussion around is this issue of Parliament representation, political competition. And it's something I've been rather, you know, obsessed with over the last few months. And in fact, International IDEA is launching a podcast, which we're calling Democracy 6 Feet Apart. And the whole idea is how do you conduct, if you're an MP, how do you conduct your casework? How do you do your constituent outreach? How can constituents participate in the process, let alone the other important functions of parliamentary oversight and legislative functions to ensure, for example, that, you know, legislation is being drafted to implement various policies related to COVID-19. And I think that to sort of share these experiences, which is the inter-PARES approach between peers, and there is actually a lot of innovation, and I hope that the tracker will be something that can capture this. In one of my pod interviews, I talked to a member of parliament from Georgia, the country I just left, where I lived 6 years. And, you know, he was describing how, in a way, you know, it's forced them to think in creative new ways. For example, his political party and his faction in the parliament has started doing online surveys. They've started doing teletown halls. They had never done this before. They've created apps on their mobile phone to allow citizens to communicate with them more directly. So they've actually harnessed a lot of not just tech tools, but new innovations in how they can carry out their work. And I also interviewed the chief of staff of a congressman in the United States who also described, measures that they've taken, not only precautions that they've taken to protect their America's majoritarians, so to protect their constituent offices and ensure that safety provisions are adhered to, but also the innovations they've done, including one aspect that I really loved, which is the congressman is doing story hour for children, where you can go online and listen to him read stories to kids, which really helps as a working mom and homeschooling children. I really appreciate that a congressman is occupying my children for a few hours. So these are things that hopefully will inspire and perhaps carry on when hopefully this crisis will end. I did want to talk just really briefly, and Tom already mentioned it, the work that International IDEA is doing with relation to COVID-19. One big project that we're launching on July 7th is this global monitor. And the idea is that it will capture and track the implications of COVID-19 measures on human rights and democracy. So we're looking, as Tom mentioned, 162 countries, and we're using the global state of democracy indicators and aspects. We have 29 of them. So we're going to be sort of tracking all these different measures and their impacts. We've already sort of have some results which are quite interesting. And the idea is not to give a sort of thumbs up, thumbs down on any particular country and their response, but rather to have a more nuanced approach, to look at specific areas of concern or potential concern and highlight this for policymakers and donors and civil society and journalists or whomever, so that they can be mindful of it. Now, as part of this process, we have also included the impact of measures on Parliament. And as Tom discussed, Parliament is so essential here, particularly in terms of its scrutiny and oversight function. And we've seen how important that is, for example, in the disbursement of funds. For example, in the United States, my country, we learned from past crises where if you just gave a carte blanche to the executive, you'd be in trouble with regard to tracking expenditures and ensure it's being spent in the right ways and doesn't just become a slush fund for the executive. So this time around, luckily, Congress did set up an oversight panel to look at how the need to quickly disperse funds doesn't necessarily preclude parliamentary scrutiny, even if it is ex post. So I think this role is essential. Information role of Parliament is essential. They are the representatives of the public. They have a duty and a responsibility to communicate what is happening, communicate the policies, legislation that they're passing in related to COVID-19, and provide accurate information, and to protect information integrity in this process, which is also under threat. So in our monitor so far, we have seen that in at least 27% of parliaments of the 162 countries that we're tracking actually are seeing some concerning or potentially concerning developments. So, for example, we've seen that Parliament hasn't been able to summon the executive. For example, in Romania, declaring states of emergency without convening Parliament. For example, in Serbia, declaring states of emergency for long periods without parliamentary approval. For example, Sierra Leone. Being adjourned indefinitely in Zambia, and Parliament dissolved even though elections have been postponed, for example, in Sri Lanka. So we hope that the tracker in PARES is really going to complement this nicely. The monitor will be looking at how COVID measures are affecting parliaments and their ability to function and serve the role. And then the tracker will be able to give specific ideas in the ways in which Parliament has adapted, the innovations they've taken. So I think these two sort of different types of monitoring tools really work well together, and both are thanks to the European Union for providing this support, for which we are very grateful. And I think I've been talking too much, but really quickly, International IDEA is also involved in a couple other projects. In addition to the global monitor with the EU, we are also linking that to a lot of other sort of more analytical case studies that we're looking at. So for example, we've done a lot of analysis on special voting arrangements. We've also looked at how COVID is affecting money in politics, and interestingly, it has in several countries had an impact there. We have done case studies. For example, we did a really, I think, exemplary case study on the South Korean elections, so where elections have been held and how that's worked. And then finally, we have worked in collaboration with many other organizations. I think now is a time more than ever where we need to work globally with our partners. You know, I heard this rather crass expression that there is no peeing section of the swimming pool. In other words, these are global crises. We are all affected by them, and therefore we have to have global responses. And nationalism does not play a role in a pandemic, nor will it with climate change or other challenges in the future. So with our partner organizations, democracy organizations, we issued a call to defend democracy. So a sort of statement of principles that had multiple organizations and over 500 signatories, including Nobel laureates, former political leaders, actors, journalists. And so this is sort of a real call to defend democracy. And as a follow-up to that, and to be more sort of prescriptive, a smaller group of organizations, including the European Endowment for Democracy and International IDEA and a few others, have written a policy paper that's like, okay, here's the call to defend democracy, but here's what we mean. And these are the policy interventions we recommend. And we sort of cover a variety of areas we really would like policymakers and donors to look at going forward. And it's written with the view of the future and with the view that this isn't, like I mentioned, the last crisis we will probably face. How can we be better prepared? How can we turn this into an opportunity, not to go back to the way things were before, but to really rethink how we are supporting democratic governance? So I think all these projects are extremely important. And I think the more that we can work together with other partners, the better. The collective energy and knowledge is something that will really benefit us all. But I'm very excited for our team Inter-Pares to present their new initiative, and I look forward to seeing the sneak preview of this tracker. So, and thanks again also to the European Union for their ongoing support. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Laura, for your talk. And both you and Thomas mentioned the global tracker, which is going to be launched by International IDEA on 7th of July. And of course, more information will be posted on the International IDEA website and on the Inter-Pares website as well. And also, I wanted to say again that this event is another opportunity not only to mark the World Parliament Day, but also 25th anniversary of International IDEA, which is this year. And now I would like to give the floor to Jonathan Murphy, Head of Program of Inter-Pares Project. So please, Jonathan.
Hi, thanks very much. It's really a great opportunity for us to talk with people across the world, and also to have such distinguished panelists. And I'd like to reiterate what Laura said, that the collaboration with the European Union is really tremendously important. And I think it underlines the fact that the European Union, as a project coming out of the Second World War, is built on democratic values. That is really at the core of what the European Union is about. And we're greatly appreciative of the chance to work with the European Union in carrying out the Inter-Pares project. I'll now go to talk a little bit about our presentation, our work. I hope that you can all see the shared screen. Yeah.
Yes, we
okay,
can.
Good. So as people have mentioned, Inter-Pares has adapted quite quickly to the change, both in the way that we're operating and also to the priorities. And of course, for every parliament around the world, the priority, as soon as the pandemic hit and it became clear that it was going to be a really major disruption to the way institutions, including parliaments, would work, we decided to focus a lot on what parliaments are doing and can do in order to continue functioning, in order to continue playing that role as an essential pillar of the democratic system. So parliaments faced with the pandemic have had to balance four different and sometimes competing priorities. The first one, which perhaps is the most important, is continuing to assume their constitutional responsibilities. We've had both Thomas and Laura already saying that there have been examples where executives have used this opportunity in order to grab power and to carry out the things they want to do without any kind of democratic scrutiny. So parliaments have the responsibility to continue legislating, to continue providing oversight, and to continue to represent citizens. Parliaments also have a critical role both in enacting and, perhaps most important, in carefully overseeing special executive powers to combat the coronavirus. Many countries, probably a majority in the world, have enacted special powers, and it's really important that what is done with those powers is both carefully scrutinized before the powers are put in place, to see, for example, what is the end date, what are the limits to these special powers, and also that the use of those powers is scrutinized throughout the time of special powers. So that's the second main role. A third role of parliamentarians are a public face of citizens, and it's crucially important that parliaments follow good health practices, good public health practices such as social distancing, so on and so forth, as an example to citizens. And finally, connected to this, of course, parliaments, parliamentarians, but also parliamentary staff and other people who use parliamentary buildings need to be able to work safely. And so parliaments have had to introduce protocols to make sure that that works. Now, parliaments, of course, have had to innovate during COVID-19. It's been almost 100 years since the last global pandemic, and so there are very few people around who can remember how we responded to that pandemic of the Spanish flu. Parliaments have had to improvise, to invent solutions, to continue carrying out their core functions. At Inter-Pares, we've documented these changes to parliamentary practices. First, in our parliamentary primer on parliaments and crisis that analyzed and covered early adaptations to the coronavirus pandemic, was published in May. And now in our global tracker, where we are providing a global database of measures taken by Parliament to respond to the crisis in 166 countries. So I'll talk a little bit about what the data tracker is. It's data that are presented graphically using the Google Data Studio application. It allows a point-and-click sorting and comparison of parliaments according to multiple criteria, country and region, changes to plenary and committee procedures, implementation of remote meeting and voting systems. And specific measures by parliament and by type of measures taken are listed in the linked data table. So the tracker is going to go live on July the 1st, that is tomorrow, and we're going to send all of the seminar participants a link to access and use the tracker. Just try to make my page down work. My screen is temporarily frozen, as happens in these moments. It's because the next screen is a screenshot of the tracker, and I suspect that it doesn't want to come up. I'm wondering, maybe Elena or Ingrid, if you would be able to try and load the data tracker page. Is that a possible thing to do? Even if I continue with the presentation and then you add it a bit later, is that possible?
Sure. Yes.
Okay. Okay. And actually, my thing has frozen altogether now. So, okay, I will continue. I'll continue in presenting. In presenting just verbally what the tracker is about. So the tracker, and then maybe you can try and put up my presentation on the whole on your screen to take over. Yeah. Is my screen still showing now?
Yes, actually, we
okay, so
yes, now we can see the.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Good. And it's gone to full. It's the full screen thing that
Yes.
that doesn't work. Okay. Okay. Sorry about that short delay. So here's a picture of what the data tracker looks like, and this is the front page of the data tracker. And as you will see, the front page shows 5 primary types of response by parliaments. What's the main ways in which Parliament have changed the way they do business and to continue functioning? So there are 5 different types of response. The first is exceptionally adjourning or dissolving Parliament. Laura had given a couple of examples. The second is partial suspension of business. The third is procedural change, and that's changing procedures. For example, some parliaments have decided only to focus on coronavirus-related topics, others only on topics of particular importance. A fourth method in which parliaments have responded is by carrying out their normal business but adopting social distancing measures. So, for example, there is the Parliament of Ireland is meeting not in the normal parliamentary building but in the convention centre in Dublin, allowing all of the parliamentarians to sit safely apart from each other. And then the fifth group of parliaments who have continued with normal procedures. So the data tracker also looks specifically at functional responses. So looking at the ways that parliaments have changed 4 key aspects of their work. Plenary sessions, what have they done to change the way plenary sessions work? Committee work, how has committee work changed? Remote meeting provisions. So as we've heard, a lot of parliaments have gone to remote meeting and also remote voting procedures. And I should say that details of the specific changes implemented in all of the parliaments are provided in the data table and the sources that are referenced and which you can access through that front page that I showed you of the world map. And the data can be sorted by region of the world, by country of the world, by primary response, as I said, whether they adjourned, partially suspended, changed procedures, etc., and by functional response, how the plenary changed, how committees changed, virtual meetings and virtual voting. And those allow anyone to cross-tabulate, to look at, well, which parliaments, let's say in Europe, suspended their business, or I want to look particularly at Afghanistan. What are the specific changes that they made in Afghanistan? So this, through a point-and-click methodology, you can access all this information, and the underlying data are also available and openly available for you to go through and look at. So what are the headline findings? First one is that nearly half of the parliaments we surveyed have made procedural changes to enable them to fulfill their constitutional duties during the pandemic. The second is that over a third of the parliaments surveyed had adopted special procedures to allow remote meetings. The preferred procedures that they followed for plenaries have tended to be either a reduced quorum, where, for example, 1 in 3 or 1 in 4 of the members of each parliamentary caucus are nominated to attend and vote at a session, or hybrid plenaries, where a limited number of MPs are present in the chamber and others participate remotely from their offices or their homes. We found that committees have proven more willing to switch to full virtual functioning, and about a quarter of parliaments have adopted remote committee work and remote committee voting procedures. In another 15% of parliaments, some committees have moved to this virtual functioning, and in about 8% of cases, all committees met virtually, but voting still had to take place in person. In other words, the meetings would be held virtually, and then from time to time, when votes had to be held, the members of parliament would be convoked to come to parliament to vote. The most popular platforms for online meetings are WebEx, Zoom, and Microsoft Teams. Should say that 19 parliaments of those surveyed have either exceptionally adjourned or were dissolved on June the 15th, 2020. But it's important to underline that some of the parliaments dissolved on June the 15th, 2020 were because of exceptional circumstances. For example, as a result of the democratic transition in Sudan, the old Sudanese parliament was dissolved and a new parliament has yet to be formed, elected and formed. As I've mentioned, the data are in the public domain. They're available on the Inter-PARES website and on International Ideas website, free for all users. Parliaments will find the data useful assessing how they responded compared with peers and identifying which further innovations they could consider. Researchers, and I hope Olivier will agree in a minute, will find the information useful for comparative analysis of the nature of innovations and causal factors, why certain parliaments made the kind of changes that they have made. And finally, parliamentary development practitioners, including Inter-PARES, will use the data to identify and leverage experiences that can be shared with partner parliaments. So we have a lot of information about what parliaments have been able to do around the world. And as we work with parliaments, our partner parliaments, we are able to identify, if you are interested in going towards a virtual method, here are parliaments, for example, with limited resources that have successfully been able to do that. Now, the next steps that we're going to carry out, parliamentary responses have evolved during the pandemic. Some parliaments have cycled through a series of different responses. They may have implemented special procedures and processes at some points and later reverted to normal practices. This tracker records a snapshot of the measures in place on June the 15th. We have a future initiative that we're designing that will follow the evolution, the timeline of measures taken by parliaments over the course of the pandemic, to be able to see, are the types of responses that became more popular or less popular as time went on. And that will also give, I think, a lot of indication of what are the likely changes that may continue after the coronavirus ends, where parliaments look at what are the things that we've learned in this pandemic that we may want to continue in the new normal afterwards. I should say that we welcome any input on how the tracker can be improved, including any corrections or clarifications. And please do write to us. The address there, interpares@idea.int. And we look forward to hearing from you. Thank you very much for the time listening to me, and I pass back to Elena.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. And I would like to mention that the primer on parliamentary innovations is available on the Inter-Pares website on the special COVID-19 section. And on this section, you can also find a couple of articles and video interviews on how do parliaments respond to the crisis. And of course, after the Inter-Pares Parliament Tracker is available online, tomorrow we'll disseminate the link not only to the participants, but also post them on our social media platforms. So please feel free to share. And now I would like to move to the final presentation, the final talk of today, of Dr. Olivier Rosenberg, Associate Professor at Sciences for PARES. And he will be talking about parliamentary oversight during the pandemic.
Thank you, Elena. I think you should allow me to share content.
Indeed, I just shared.
Thank you. Yes, can you see my presentation?
Yes, we can see.
Yes. So thanks a lot for your invitation. I know we're running a bit out of time, so I'll be brief, showing you this picture of an MP from Mexico during an e-parliamentary meeting with some colleagues from his group. And well, if you look at this meeting, it looks like a politician or a businessman during an ordinary meeting like you and I just now. But if you have another look at the whole person, you see that he's wearing Bermuda shorts. And well, I put these figures to make you smile, but also to tell that, well, maybe parliaments are changing now, and we can have MPs doing through parliamentary work from their home, from their desk, wearing Bermuda shorts. And well, obviously this challenges the traditional functions of parliaments. The pandemic did not create this situation, but it accelerated it in many ways. And I think it's time to have a reflection about it. I'd like to start first showing you the results very quickly of a survey we conducted with colleagues in France and Israel about how the parliaments react to the crisis. So this is rather close to what has been just shown, but just to show you some results, we asked experts worldwide to field a very simple scale with 10 levels on the functioning of parliament, from 1 close to 10 business as usual. So it gives something like this. On an other scale, on the use of electronic device, remote meeting, remote voting, from 1 no technology to 4 remote voting. And the result is regarding the functioning of parliament. Well, you see that the average is of 6.6, which says very little things to anyone. But if we differentiate between kinds of political regimes through international recognized indexes, we see, which was expected, that the full so-called advanced democracies are close to 8, so close to the full functioning of parliaments, whereas at the time of the survey, it was the countries where the pandemic was most developed, should be said. But we see something which is more interesting and less expected in a way, is the fact that parliaments have been less closed in full dictatorships than in intermediary countries. And probably it's for 2 reasons. At least that's our interpretation. The first is the fact that for full dictator, parliament may be less painful in a way, because it's less constraining for their capacity to direct the country. Whereas in intermediary countries, well, the pandemic could be an opportunity for a less authoritarian leader to silence their legislature. First explanation. Second explanation has to do with the fact that when you, as a dictator, close your parliament because of the pandemic, it comes with a cost, which is accepting to acknowledge publicly that there is an health issue, that there is a pandemic. So it's likely that some authoritarians, dictators, have decided to let their parliament function in order not to admit that they were experiencing health issue. And you can have a look here at the averages by regions of the world. I put America and Europe together because they have the same grade. Regarding the use of electronic devices, well, again, it's aggregate data of 160 countries, so it's very limited information, but still, it shows a limited use of electronic devices. It's true that some have experienced new things, but even in full democracy, which are usually richer and with more developed devices, you see a limited development. More generally, I'd like to make the point that during this pandemic, there has been a kind of trade-off in many countries between lawmaking and oversight activities, with challenges in lawmaking. It has been said by many orators before me. It was difficult both for institutional and political reasons to properly legislate. It was not impossible, but it was more difficult because there was this pressure of health issue, the emergency needed in many cases with special procedures, fast-track procedures, plenary closed or plenary half closed. This is for legal aspect, but for political aspect, there was also huge pressure put on the shoulders of the MPs to agree to what was proposed by prime ministers or presidents, and not to appear as responsible for any aspects of the disease, with strong calls for consensus. Well, consensus may be sometimes needed, but legislatures are de facto unfitted for consensus because it's a pluralist institutions. Vis-a-vis these difficulties, there has been a kind of compensation through oversight with a diversity of procedures used, questions, topical debates, special committees, including committees of inquiry. So diversity of procedure and the flexibility of the procedure with the capacity to adapt to the pandemic with virtual hearings. And we've seen with Jonathan that 1/4 of the committees have experienced virtual meetings. I should also add that, MPs were like us, civil servants or academics during the crisis. They were at home and sometimes they were bored. And these are persons that are not used to be bored. So embedding them into oversight activities was also a way to keep them busy or a bit busy, to feed them, to give them things to do. Let me develop two examples or two illustrations. One which has been controversial, which is the House of Commons in Canada. There's been, yes, controversy between the Liberals and the conservative opposition on what should be done. And in the end, they have decided to have this, to transform the whole assembly into a special committee. So the assembly was no longer a plenary assembly, but became fully a committee. And this committee here, for instance, here, Justin Trudeau, with a mix of in-person sittings and virtual meetings. In France, it has been decided, second example, to create a special committee. France was a severe place of the pandemic with a few, some MPs who died of it. So it was the crisis was severe within the building, as in Iran. So it was difficult to keep plenary things. They decided to create a special committee led by the speaker that you can see on the left in this picture. The speaker is the only MP within the room, but there are through the screen all the presidents of the standing committees, all the presidents of the parliamentary groups who can question here the prime minister for 3.5 hours. And when was it? I put it prime minister hearing on this chart on the number of dead and sick persons in France. It was during the very days of the peak of the pandemic that the French Prime Minister devoted 3 to 4 hours to being questioned in the national assemblies. And 1 month after, he gave a key speech on the floor of the assembly. So this to say that, well, it's easy to be pessimistic regarding parliaments, but things have been done on the oversight aspect. To finish, it calls for questioning the virtual functioning of parliament, and I think we're just at the beginning of the analysis of this. And I just want to say that there are some pros on some cons. Among the pros, there is the fact that oversight is possible from a distance. There is the fact that it may be a venue for associating NGOs and civil society, and there are interesting examples of that now in Brazil, for instance. It can also be technically interesting to have virtual meetings in intercultural context with the possibility to have automatic subtitling, which is experienced in the European Parliament and which can make life easier for interparliamentary cooperation, especially in a worldwide regional assembly. So there are some positive elements, but also there are threats to consider without assuming that the e-world would be the perfect world. First, the fact that debates are a bit less colorful. Well, it's difficult to imagine the British question time under screen, if you see my point. Second, there is possibility of free riding from MPs who pretend to attend to a meeting but who are not attending it, or who are doing other things meanwhile, who are leaving the meetings, etc. And it's easier to do it under a screen than when you have to go physically within the room. Third, there's an inequality between MPs who sit in person during the meeting and those who attend through online participation. And it raises concrete issues I know you are interested in, of gender, of minorities, of MPs elected from peripheries who face more difficulties to attend to meetings. Fourth, and that's something that Elena may illustrate within a minute, with online meetings, there is more agency from the chair, who can cut the camera, who can cut the micros. And well, that's an issue in a pluralist place where the word of the opposition has to be heard and has to be respected. So I think this analysis calls for further analysis, but also in the future further regulations and maybe of the standing orders of parliaments, answering questions, difficult questions, such as what should be kept non-virtual from this meeting? How can we check who is behind the screen? You know, we can check in some cases what an MP has voted for. Maybe we could check if he or she is present in person behind the screen. When do MPs should have a monopoly over speeches? When can they share it with civil society during those kinds of meetings? And who is controlling the electronic devices used for those meetings? Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Olivier, for your very interesting presentation. And I sincerely believe that even if one of us is wearing Bermuda pants right now, the attendees still find the event and the presentations enriching and useful. And indeed, we're running out of time and delayed with our agenda, but I hope that the speakers and attendees will agree to take 10 more minutes in order to answer questions in the Q&A session. And I would like to encourage the participants to use the Q&A panel on the right side of your screens and ask questions in written, just to be a bit more efficient, because this will allow us to move quicker with the questions. We actually received several pre-submitted questions in the registrations forms, and I would like to start with one of them. So I just will ask the speakers when you would like to reply, please remember to unmute yourself. So the first question is, what good practices could parliaments take to avoid signing a blank check to the government in case of a state of emergency, such as the pandemic? Some parliaments had already developed business continuity plans. Was that useful? And Jonathan, maybe you would like to answer this question, please.
It's a very good question indeed. The first thing is that I think there was a correlation between parliaments that had good contingency plans for operation and successful continuity. For example, both Finland and New Zealand were very serious in terms of how they responded to the pandemic, and both of them did have good planning. As far as the key thing that needs to be done in order to ensure not giving a blank check, in my view, it's making sure that there's a very effective oversight of the emergency measures. And a number of parliaments, several dozen parliaments, have established special committees that very carefully went over the work that the government was doing. In a couple of cases, they even allowed those committees to be chaired by the opposition, by the leader of the opposition, and that kept a real scrutiny and a real transparency of what was going on. On the other side, the parliaments that adjourned and perhaps that passed emergency regulations and then adjourned or didn't carry out any particular oversight, I think there's a governance risk that was created there.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. Does anyone else would like to add anything? Olivier, sure.
Yes, I can add it that regarding the committees, well, there's a trade-off between having a special committee and doing it with special prerogative rights and relying on existing standing committees. And sometimes MPs and speakers have the reflex to develop a special committee because it looks special, it has a special flavor, etc. But there can be an advantage in relying on existing committee where there is already an experience, an expertise gathered. So, well, there is never full security regarding blank check to the executive, but yeah, relying on existing standing committees may be good.
All right, thank you very much, Olivier. If I may, I would like to ask one of the questions which we received from a colleague from Greece in the Q&A box. So how can academia assist knowledge preservation so that in an unlikely event or of similar disruption, parliaments will not reinvent the wheel? Olivier, would you like to answer this one?
I'm not sure I fully get it, Elena.
So how can academia assist knowledge preservation so that even if it happens again, a similar disruption, parliaments will not try to reinvent the wheel, but use the practices which were developed?
Well, a good question. I would be rather pessimistic about that. You know, we have good historians of what the parliaments have done during the First World War, for instance. And parliament in France and UK have greatly adapted to the specific context of the war, with some MPs who were soldiers at that time and who came back from the battles to sit in the parliaments during very deep oversight, etc. So there is this legacy from the past, which is known by some academics that you can find in books, and that the rest of society, including politicians, ignore. So I would be pessimistic, but that's also maybe a role of an organization such as yours to share the academic knowledge.
Thank you very much. Does anyone want to add to this? No. Okay. I would like to ask one question which is not particularly focusing on parliaments. So the past weeks and months have seen a rise of disinformation, and the corona pandemic has also been called infodemic. Given that disinformation undermines the functioning of democracy, how can this issue be tackled on an institutional level and beyond? Maybe Laura or Thomas, you would like to answer this one?
I'm happy to answer. Yes, I mean, this is something that we've been having lots of discussions about, and certainly disinformation was already presenting challenges to democracy and democratic governance and institutions prior to COVID. I think perhaps what now that it has life and death consequences as opposed to just stealing an election consequences, it's sort of risen to the top. However, I think we need to also be mindful of how this has affected freedom of expression during this particular time. And one of the things we've noted in our global monitor is that this has been used, particularly by hybrid and non-democracies, as an excuse to further clamp down on speech. So in other words, we're so worried about disinformation about the pandemic, which is a legitimate worry. You don't want people taking hydroxychloroquine because the leader of your country says it's good for you. So you want to stop disinformation about the pandemic to protect people, but at the same time, restricting speech has gone beyond just information about the pandemic. So I think it's just opened the desperate need for us to address this issue. And I think you mentioned an institutional response. I mean, I think there's just multi-layers to this problem. And unfortunately, I don't think there's a magic bullet. We talk about regulations, we talk about regulating Facebook or social media, and we have seen actually Twitter and take some small steps in this regard. Facebook has not. But I think we also need to look at the fact that this is a supply and demand problem. And unfortunately, I think it's going to take the long haul of citizenry and civic education and media literacy, starting at a very young age, working with ministries of education, working on how to decipher good information from bad information. I mean, frankly, the limitations at the supply side, it's like squeezing a water balloon. You push this end, will come out the other. So, but I do think we've seen the consequences of this in a very real way. And I hope that this, again, gives us the sort of motivation to, move forward and create some more interesting approaches to tackling this problem beyond this sort of fact check, beyond the calling out when we see it, but how do we build that inoculation and that resistance in society to this problem? It's a big one, and we better address it.
Can I just come in on that as well? I agree with everything that Laura just said, but just to add that, from the supply and demand point of view, you can work on trying to decrease the flow of disinformation. That's one way of doing it, but also increasing the supply of real quality information is another aspect you've got to work on. And I heard the expression yesterday. I think the flight to quality, that now that the stakes are so much higher, people are really seeking out information which is qualitative, fact-checked, reliable in a way that maybe they haven't done before. We all know about the kind of media extinction event that we're facing globally because of changes in consumption patterns and changes in the economic parameters and changing in the political climate as well, and that's been accelerated, as we've heard, by the COVID crisis. And one thing that we're doing from the EU point of view is for example, we have 2 programs ongoing, we're just about to be launched now, working in Latin America and Africa to help journalists and independent media deal with the economic, social and political impacts of COVID, to make sure that they can keep functioning. By issuing grants, by making sure that particularly marginalized communities get access to the information they need, but also have a voice and a say in the things that are going on. And also part of that is fact checking the disinformation that's out there. So I think that, media, independent media is never been more important than it is today. It's a matter of life and death.
Thank you very much, both Laura and Thomas. And I would like to move to the next question, which was received in the Q&A chat. So from your conversations with parliamentarians and staff, are there any specific innovations or trends that you think are particularly likely to continue and be taken further after COVID-19? Maybe Jonathan, would you like to answer this one?
Well, yeah, I'll follow up actually with the example that Olivier gave of Brazil having introduced a very interesting opportunity for citizens to actually intervene or to pass their comments during parliamentary debates using the app that the Brazilian, I think it was the Senate, first of all, had organized in order to run their virtual sessions. So there are opportunities for increasing Parliament's connection with citizens. On the other hand, I do think that there are some forms of debate, there are some forms of dialogue that are quite a lot more difficult to do virtually, and I think parliaments need to pick and choose. I do want to misuse my microphone to respond a little bit to Olivier's last point about whether having a special committee or having the ordinary standing committees respond to COVID is a better thing. I do think it's kind of a trade-off, because the risk is that if it's divided between existing committees, that perhaps security and health and safety issues will be seen as more important, and the human rights issues can be shuffled off to a human rights committee and perhaps not taken so seriously. So perhaps some kind of combination is needed of both specialized look at these issues, which I agree very much with Olivier, but also some method of consolidating and making difficult decisions about trade-offs. Sorry for abusing the mic.
No worries, Jonathan. Thank you very much for answering. Anyone else would like to add? Laura, please.
Super quickly. I mentioned it in my opening remarks, but one thing I loved that I've heard folks doing, you know, there's obviously you can use various online tools for outreach, right? Constituent outreach, getting information from Parliament or MPs out to folks. But what I've loved is that reverse, the in-reach, and using online surveys. I think that's been a really interesting use of that I hope continues, where they've created, you know, little quick survey monkeys to get citizens' response about various pressing matters, but also just in general, like some of the political parties that that I've worked with have used it also to help them ahead of elections to contribute to their platform development. And that's a really quick, easy way to sort of incorporate citizen input. And I hope that that can continue. I see no reason why it can't.
Thank you very much, Laura. I think I will read out the last question for today. We received it also via chat. So at the time when the public is concerned about their health, jobs, children, education, etc., how can we convince them that it's important to pay attention to the proper functioning of parliaments during the pandemic? Is anyone would like to answer this one? Jonathan?
Well, I think we need to convince people that those particular issues are the issues that parliaments need to decide upon. When we've done the study of how parliaments have reacted to the pandemic, I give an example of the Parliament of Finland that decided that some of the special powers were going to overly restrict the rights of some particular employees, affecting employment. Obviously, the decisions that are made about healthcare are critically important. Parliaments had to make decisions about how services were going to be organized at this time of extreme crisis. So I think exactly that it's an opportunity when parliaments are working effectively to show that the voice of citizens, the needs of citizens are being represented and are being considered in these really difficult times.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. Laura, please.
Yeah, absolutely. Parliament's essential to pass the healthcare legislation that you need to protect people's health going forward, to pass unemployment insurance or minimum wage so that people aren't struggling paycheck to paycheck. And I mean, you know, sheltering in place is an enormous economic privilege. It's not something everyone can do. But I think also back to sort of the point I made earlier, and I seem to drum on a lot about these days, but it's also exposed the failures of the social contract between citizens and state, and that linkage is the representative body of the legislature. So I think we've seen where particularly this pandemic has emphasized to us that democracy hasn't quite delivered in a lot of places on those economic issues, on those, you know, bread and butter issues. And this is indeed an opportunity to try to rebuild that social contract. And it really is, it falls on Parliament's shoulders to do that. Because I mean, in theory, we elect representatives to pass legislation and policies that protect us, ensure our safety, ensure safety nets for our employment and our economic well-being. But what we've seen instead is this elite capture and a problem with money in politics. And I hope that this is a little bit of a wake-up call, as I said, to start to rethink that social contract, tackle some of the issues that allow our parliaments not to even look like us, being mostly male, mostly from, mostly in my country, white, and mostly millionaires. So again, going back to issues of inclusion, money in politics, more representative bodies that reflect the needs and interests of citizens. And I think that this pandemic has made that clearer than ever.
Thank you very much, Laura. So I would love to continue this lovely discussion and answer all the questions which were asked, but unfortunately, I think it's time to move to the closing remarks, and I would like to give the floor first to Jonathan Murphy.
Well, I would just like, first of all, to thank everybody who tuned into this, and particularly people who asked good and difficult questions. That's much appreciated. I would like to thank Olivier Rosenberg for providing a scholarly perspective, and definitely we want to take him up on the challenge to build closer links between parliamentary development and scholarship, and make sure that deep thinking about parliaments is also translated into options, opportunities, and ideas for parliaments. I'd like to thank Thomas Miller and, as always, the European Union, both for the financial support that makes this program possible, but also particularly Thomas for your, I think, very insightful and strong comments at the beginning of the seminar, which are really appreciated. And of course, I'd like to thank my boss, Laura, and I'd like to thank our whole team at PARES for putting this together.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. I think maybe Thomas, would you like to say maximum 1 minute, please?
Maximum 1 minute. Okay. Well, first of all, I just want to say thanks to everyone. I think it's been very stimulating, very interesting debate. Look, not on parliaments. Let me just say a more general thing, and strong again. I think COVID puts into focus the challenges that we've been facing globally for some years. If you look at the VDEM data, for example, it's the first time since 2001 autocracies are in the majority. That's more than 50% of the population. The state higher now than ever before. People are paying with their lives. Why do I say that? Well, you can't do a simple regression analysis, but and I think VDEM and IDEA has certainly worked on this, but a good response to the crisis requires not just state capacity, but it requires information, reliable information. It requires debate, and it requires public trust. COVID is, if you like, the horrible lesson that we shouldn't have to learn again. Authoritarianism, centralization, polarization, suppression of information, repression of difference and dissent, they don't work. They never have worked, and they certainly don't work in times of crisis. So we need to have deliberative, pluralist democracies. allowing everyone to fully participate in informed debate. And that takes work, I think, from the ground upwards, with ordinary citizens, with media, with civil society, political parties. But central to all that must be parliaments that innovate, can do things differently, can adapt. And I think that, you know, the old saying, you shouldn't let a good crisis go to waste, because the other side certainly isn't. The non-democrats aren't going to let this go to waste, so we shouldn't either. There you go, that's a minute and a half. I have other things to say, but continue.
Thank you very much, Thomas. Sorry for asking you to be short. And maybe Olivier, would you like to add something from your side?
Yeah, in the world, you know, I come from a country where there's this battle between les anciens et les modernes, so ancient and modern world. It's a classical gap in culture, etc. And I think we should avoid that for the future of parliaments regarding the possibility to look to use electronic devices. That was my point. There are some great possibilities, but also really threats. So we should avoid, I guess, too ideological position toward it.
Thank you very much, Olivier. And Laura, the final remarks from you, please.
Nothing from me. I just want to thank you all. This is an incredibly impressive project. I think it's going to be extremely useful in terms of gathering some of those lessons learned as we discussed. And again, I want to thank the European Union for their ongoing support, both for this Inter-PARES tracker and the broader global monitor that International IDEA is doing with EU to look at the democracy impact of this crisis. So thank you so much for the opportunity.
Thank you very much. And from myself, I would like to, of course, thank all the attendees and all those who asked questions in the forum and in the chat, though we didn't have time to answer them all. I would like to thank Dr. Olivier Rosenberg, Laura Thornton, Jonathan Murphy, and Thomas Miller for joining us today. And just the final remark I would like to share with the attendees is that if you have any comments, questions, or if you would like to provide any feedback on the events or on the tracker that will be published tomorrow, please feel free to write us on our email address, interpares@idea.int, and then, of course, subscribe to our social media channels, because we're trying to post new updates on Parliamentary World weekly, and check our website, of course. And with this, I would like to end the event. Thank you very much, everyone, and we hope to see you at the future events of Inter-PARES. Have a good afternoon, evening, or the morning, wherever you are. Bye-bye.